Now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, the priest, said, "Let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies." "You are not the one to take the news today," Joab told him. "You may take the news another time, but you must not do so today, because the king's son is dead." However, David does not take kindly to hearing bad news. Joab remembers that. Who knows? David may kill Ahimaaz for bringing him this bad news. Then Joab said to a Cushite, a non-Israelite in other words, "Go, tell the king what you have seen." The Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." But Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring a reward." He said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So he's running a different route and apparently getting there faster. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, "If he is alone, he must be bringing good news." And the man came closer and closer. David wants to think anything he can think of to think it's going to be good news. Then the watchman saw another man running, and he called down to the gatekeeper, "Look, another man running alone." The king said, "He must be bringing good news also." The watchman said, "It seems to me like the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." So apparently this guy had a very recognizable gait when he ran. You know, these guys, talking about running, this would have been their job. This would have been their assignment. You would have had some people, some men, whose purpose, whose mission, whose assignment in the battle was to run back and forth and carry messages. That would be true. I mean, that would be true basically throughout almost all human. I mean, eventually they would ride horses. But it's like that idea of sending someone to run to spread the message of the news of the battle, or it's like that's going to be the way it is for centuries and centuries to come. In this case, they're running on foot. They don't have enough horses to go around that everybody gets to ride a horse. Apparently, this Ahimaaz had a very distinguished gait, so that when you saw him coming, you could tell who it was even before you could make out his face. "He's a good man," the king said. "He comes with good news. He really wants to believe he's about to hear good news. He's trying so hard to convince himself he's about to hear good news." Then Ahimaaz called out to the king. So Ahimaaz gets there first. "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king." The king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" That's all he really cares about. Ahimaaz answered, "I saw great confusion, just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was." So he knows what happened, but he's trying to soften the news for David. I'm guessing this is why he was so determined to run to David, is that he wants to deliver this news to David softly and gently. And apparently, he thinks he can do that. The king said, "Stand aside and wait here." So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you." The king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." In other words, dead. Dead and defeated. That's what Absalom is, and may all David's enemies end up like him. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you "Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." He is definitely feeling a lot of guilt for what happened to Absalom. Overwhelming, actually. Like it's racking him. His guilt over what happened to Absalom is just coursing through him. Now, this was a situation years in the making. You go all the way back to 2 Samuel 13 when the rape of Tamar happens, and Absalom first begins plotting his schemes. I mean, I don't know what Absalom was like as a child or as a youth. I mean, when we first read about him and Amnon and Tamar in chapter 13, they would be young adults. Tamar may have been a teenager, but Amnon and Absalom would have been young adults probably in their early 20s. I don't know what he would have been like before that. Did he used to be a sweet kid that David, liked and got along with? I don't know. Did he go from being a good kid and a proper, fine, upstanding young man to this? I don't know. Or was he always kind of dark and brooding and scheming? I mean, he might have been, I don't know. We don't know anything about him until here. But you go from chapter 13, and you go the rape of Tamar by Amnon, and 2 years later, Absalom moves against Amnon. Then he flees to Geshur for 3 years. Then he is brought back to Jerusalem and stays there for 3 years, 2 years. And then he finally meets with David again, and then he's in Jerusalem, conspiring against David for 4 years. This was a long process by which Absalom went from where we first saw him, or really first into the story as a young man to now. And this was a decade plus of just constant decline. Absalom just kind of moving farther and farther away from David, farther and farther away from God, until this happened. And David could have done something about it. We read a lot in those chapters about David just in action. Him being furious at Amnon and the situation with Tamar, but not doing anything about it. Him thinking a lot about Absalom and obsessing over Absalom and not doing anything about it. Then bringing Absalom back and keeping him at arm's distance, keeping him at a distance. Like, David could have changed the circumstance a number of times over the course of the last 10 years and never did. So I think a lot of his grief here is losing his son, but he's probably, the source of his grief is probably more due to the fact that he probably feels like he could have prevented this from happening in any number of ways over a period of several years beforehand, and he just never did. So he's feeling like, I should have died. I should, it's like, I'm responsible for this. I should have been the one to die. By the way, this is now son number 3. So David is going to pay back 4 times what he took from Uriah. And so he's paid one son, the baby son that was born as a product of his union with Bathsheba, and he's lost Amnon, and now he's lost Absalom. So we're 3/4 of the way there. Joab was told, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, the king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are shamed when they flee from battle. So they're acting like they lost. It's like going back to the locker room. Instead of going back to the locker room after a victory, after a victorious game, after winning, you're acting like you're losing. The king covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" So he is not hiding his grief over Absalom, his son. Remember how, way back in the days of Moses and Aaron, Aaron's 2 oldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, died when they violated the Lord's presence, could profane the Lord's presence, and brought in, on the day of when they first established their worship system in Israel, way back in Leviticus 10, the very day that they first inaugurated the priesthood. They had gone through the 7-day consecration process. It was now the 8th day. They were beginning their ministry as priests for the first time. And Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's 2 older sons, offer strange fire, unauthorized fire, fire that came from an unauthorized source, to the Lord, and were punished by death because of that, for that. And it says, Leviticus 10, verse 6. So these are Aaron's two sons, and he has two more, their brothers. So Moses said, this is Leviticus 10:6, Moses says to Aaron and his sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, so the father and brothers of the two men who just died, do not let your hair become unkempt, basically tear your hair or mess up your hair, and do not tear your clothes, those are both signs of mourning, or you will die, and the Lord will be angry with the whole community. But your relatives, all the house of Israel, may mourn for those the Lord has destroyed by fire. But Aaron and his sons could not. They were told to refrain from engaging in public mourning. The other relatives of the men who died could, but they could not. Because if they had, they would have set a bad example, because they were put to death for violating the Lord's prohibitions. So if Aaron and his sons, or the two remaining priests, had mourned for them publicly, they would have set a bad example for the rest of the nation. Here, David is mourning very publicly, very loudly, and very publicly for his son Absalom, and is setting a terrible example for the rest of the nation. So the soldiers, the men who fought for David, are now feeling like they lost instead of won. Then Joab went into the house to the king and said, today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life, and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth until now. So Joab is giving David some tough love right here. He's being pretty harsh and frank with him, but he's telling David what he needs to hear to whip him into shape and get him to act like a king again. So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes. Throughout the tribes of Israel, the people were all arguing with each other, saying, the king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country because of Absalom, and Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? Be quiet. So they got a problem here. What are they going to do? Are they going to bring the king back? Are they going to put themselves under David's authority again? I mean, he had been their king for years. He fought with them. He won their battles. He fought their wars. They probably were ready to move on. He was probably old, and it seems like he was getting detached in his older days. I think, as we'll read later, he might have spent most of his time thinking about the plans for the temple that he wanted to build later on. Well, his son would actually end up building it. It seems as though he had become somewhat withdrawn and detached from their people in his later days. Absalom had put himself out there as a public face for years. He was a younger man. I think the people, the generation of the Israelites, are probably just ready to move on. I don't think they harbored any ill will towards David. I mean, the Benjamites might have. Shimei did. We read about that earlier. I don't think the rest of the people harbored any ill will towards David, but I do think they were generally ready to move on to a new generation of leadership. But now that that's over, now what do you do? King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters? You are my brothers, my own flesh and blood. So why should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, remember Amasa was the guy that Absalom made his commander, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if from now on You are not the commander of my army in place of Joab." He went over the hearts of all the men of Judah as though they were one man. They sent word to the king, "Return, you and all your men." And the king returned and went as far as the Jordan. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal. That's where they camped when they came out into the land to begin with in the days of Joshua, way back when. The men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Shimei, remember him? He was the one who was cursing David as he left. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite of Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, remember him? The steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king, well, they got to make amends. They wronged the king on their way on his way out of the land. So now they've got to make amends. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first, of the whole house of Joseph, to come down and meet my lord the king." That basically means the tribes of the north. We have 12 tribes of Israel. We have 3 that are across the Jordan, the eastern part of the country, which is not even technically part of the promised land. We have Judah and Simeon, which is to the south. And the other 8 tribes are in the north of the actual promised land. And that area would eventually become and pretty soon, after the days of Solomon, David's son, they're going to split into 2 kingdoms. There's going to be a clear divide between the north and the south. Right now they're kind of united, but there's going to eventually be a clear divide between the north and the south. And the northern kingdom is going to become identified with Ephraim, which is one of Joseph's sons. So saying the house of Joseph basically refers to the tribes of the north. And that distinction has been there almost since the beginning. We read clues almost from the time they came into the land that there was already a distinction between the tribes of the north and the south, and the tribes of the north were dominated by the tribes that come from Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, Ephraim in particular being the one that would end up kind of like being the dominant tribe. So saying that he's from the house of Joseph means he's from the northern tribes. So I'm the first of these. Now Benjamin will end up aligning with Judah. In the long run, Benjamin is going to end up aligning with the south. Right? Benjamin is right north of Judah. In fact, Jerusalem is in the territory of Benjamin. So Benjamin is the tribe directly north of Judah, and they will eventually end up siding with the south instead of the north. But at this point in time, they're still opposed. The Saul, of course, being a Benjamite, and David being an enemy of Saul. There is still a lot of friction there, but eventually the Benjamites will end up siding with the Judahites. So today I have come as the first of the whole house of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king. Then Abishai, that guy again, son of Zeruiah, said, "Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed." David replied, "David has shown mercy to Shimei once already. What's he going to do now, huh? What do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? This day you have become my adversaries. Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Do I not know that today I am king over Israel?" So the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king promised him on oath that he will put a punishment on Shimei that his son Solomon will deal with later on. We'll read that when we get to the book of 1 Kings. So David isn't just letting Shimei go completely scot-free, but he is not putting him to death. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. Remember him? We didn't see of him on David's way out. He had not taken care of his feet. Remember, his feet are crippled. Or trimmed his mustache, or washed his clothes, from the day the king left until the day he returned. So he was in pretty bad shape here. When he came down from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" He said, "My lord the king, Since I, your servant, am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled and will ride on it so I can go with the king. And he needs help to move. He's not able to get around easily on his own. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me. And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever pleases you. All my grandfather's descendants deserved nothing but death from my lord the king. But basically Saul's household. But you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king? The king said to him, Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the fields. The king doesn't really know who's telling the truth. Mephibosheth probably is, but the king doesn't really know. So he's going to go ahead and split them between them. Mephibosheth said to the king, Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has arrived home safely. He probably doesn't really mean that. This is a typical, Middle Eastern way of showing humility and graciousness to your people that you're dealing with. It doesn't say that David made that ruling. Mephibosheth probably didn't intend for him to really do that. He's just trying to be humble and gracious here. Barzillai the Gileadite also came down from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way from there. Now Barzillai was a very old man, 80 years of age. He had provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you. But Barzillai answered the king, How many more years will I live, that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is good and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of men and women singers? Why should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will cross over the Jordan with the king for a short distance. But why should the king reward me in this way? Let your servant return, that I may die in my own town, in the tomb of my father and mother. But here, he's not coming for his own benefit. He did not come to greet the king because he wanted his own reward, but he did have a reason. He did have something he wanted the king to do. Here is your servant Kimham. Let him cross over with my lord the king. Do whatever pleases, do for him whatever pleases you. So he wants David's blessings to be on this other guy, probably a younger guy. Not on himself. He's fine with his own lot in life. But he did bring this other guy with him, and he wants the king to bless this other guy. The king said, Kimham shall come over with me, and I will do for him whatever pleases you. Anything you desire from me, I will do for you. So all the people crossed the Jordan, and then the king crossed over. The king kissed Barzillai and gave him his blessing, and Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. I'm going to go ahead and stop there.